Hi, I'm Dylan Paris. I'm a musician, YouTuber, I work in tech in my day job, and today I want to talk about the MPC Live II from Akai and whether or not it's worth it in 2022. So last year I made a video about the MPC Live I, the original model, and was it worth it in 2021? And a lot of what was true about that video is true here, but I do want to touch on the specifics of the two, how I use it, what its big pros are for me, what the cons are, and should you pick one up. One of the big differences in how I've been using gear in the last year versus the years before is that I'm trying to hold on to most gear rather than continually swapping things out. I'll sell things if they're redundant, but for the most part, especially with music equipment, I'm trying to hold multiple things at once. I still have a Machine Plus, I have a MacBook Pro, which I use for Ableton, I have a bunch of different MIDI controllers I use with Ableton, as well as with my DAW-less gear, and obviously I have the MPC Live II. Now, to be honest, the biggest con for me with the MPC Live II is simply that I personally haven't given it enough time and attention to really learn a lot of the ins and outs. I consider myself probably somewhere between beginner and intermediate with the MPC Live workflow because I did have two MPC Lives in the past and I have used this one a bit. I do understand what I'm doing, but I also know there's so much more that can be done with this thing, and that almost any limitation you're going to encounter is going to be a limitation of your own understanding of the OS and your own skills versus a hardware limitation, which is kind of my favorite thing about this, even if it's a con in the sense that I need to get good with this thing. That being said, there's a lot I've already learned how to do with it that I really enjoy. So is it worth it? I think really depends on a couple different factors. Anything in this kind of price range, I think it retails for $1,300. I paid $1,000, and that included an installed 500 gigabyte SSD. So it was a really good deal for me, and I think if you're in the used market, that's really what I would suggest for most gear like this. In my experience, buying things new and being an early adopter has not been the best, especially last year. I think I had more misses than hits when it comes to buying things new and paying full price. There's usually things that need to be ironed out in the OS, and things usually drop in price over time. Buying used gear the way I bought this on Reverb or any other platform locally or eBay or whatever is a good way to get in on a piece of gear for less than you might pay otherwise. However, it's still pretty expensive. If you want a broad overview of all of the groove boxes and their different categories, I would recommend checking out Gabe Miller Music. He's a much bigger channel than me, but he does cover a lot of this stuff more in depth and compares individual groove boxes in real time, and he is a really good resource for things like Novation Circuit, the MPC I. I think he's messing around with the Polyend tracker right now, as a lot of YouTubers are. Also, Polyend, feel free to send me a tracker if you watch this for some reason. I would love to check that out as well. But for me, I think given what this thing can do, it is priced accurately. One of my big complaints in my Machina Plus review last year was that it didn't really feel like you were getting what you were paying for and what was being advertised. And I really think if you do basic research on the MPC Live II in 2022, you will see that it is offering a lot and it hits the targets it offers. It actually does what it says it does, and even for retail price, it's probably worth it. But because it is pretty simple to find a used one for about $300 less, and they're pretty well made and robust in their design, I think a used one is absolutely okay, and it's definitely what I went for. So what makes this thing awesome compared to the Live I? It has some additional functionality and buttons in its layout, and then obviously it has this speaker. Now the speaker is interesting because I think it's both a really big game changer and also not a huge deal, just depending on how you use it. So from time to time I will use the speaker when producing things, and it is really nice to give my ears a break from headphones and to not have to go plug in any external speakers or monitors. It's really cool when you're hanging out with friends or with other musicians and you want to create something and have them be able to hear it in real time. It's not necessarily going to replace professional studio monitors or mixing headphones, but I don't think they're claiming to. It is giving you a good broad spectrum of sound with bass and all of your instruments in stereo and pretty discernible as far as what's happening. So I think it's a great way to create and compose. It's not how I would do my final mixing, but I also don't know if I would do my final mixing and mastering on the MPC Live. That being said, I do believe you really could. With all of the effects that are on here, even if you wanted to do vocals, now that there's the whole vocal suite on board, I really do think you could just use this and compose, mix, master using limiting and compression and EQing. It's really possible to do everything in this box. It's part of what I was talking about earlier, where there's more for me to learn if I wanted to do that. But as someone who tends to finish my songs up in a DAW, specifically Ableton, I don't necessarily feel like I'm going to go that in depth with making everything from start to total finish on here. But the fact that you can is a huge value add. And when you consider the fact that buying a laptop with a DAW on it will probably put you in a similar price range, if not more, depending on the machine, then you start to see like huge value here. Now, in comparison to some of the competitors, it also, I believe, is one of the only ones that can do what this does and has a battery. which is huge. Now, devices like the MPC One and the Machine Plus can be run off of external batteries, so it's not necessarily a killing blow to the competition, but it is something you don't have to add in the price, and it's something you don't have to add when you're considering traveling with it, right? Everything's already in here, and that is really convenient. The battery life is really great. I think that has a lot to do with one of the core strengths of the MPC platform, which is the hardware and the software match each other really well. And I'm not just talking about the pads, which are fantastic, and the tactile buttons and knobs, but also the hardware of the processor. It utilizes an ARM processor, and because everything feels designed for it, the plugins, the various instruments such as hype, tube synth, bass synth, key groups in general, pretty much everything this thing can do feels like it was designed for the hardware that's actually in here. I'm not trying to fire shots, but that can be a weak point with other devices. Because of that, it gives you good battery life, it gives you good performance. I have not hit limitations with this. Limitations do exist, absolutely, because it is a computer at the end of the day, and all computers have their limitations. But going back to what I was saying a second ago, because things were programmed for these specs and designed for these specs, it feels like a very big, vast, open sandbox playing field to do what you want to do, and not like you're running into walls all the time, which can happen in my experience with other groove boxes, such as the Machine Plus, which are trying to take a desktop experience and put it on a portable device. This feels designed for what it is. The MPC Live II has a huge range of I/O, including multiple USB ports, which can be used for hard drives. I use them specifically for MIDI controllers. Just being able to plug in a MIDI controller, get MIDI in and out, and power it off of USB, off the internal battery is super cool. Another reason why this thing just feels really convenient and well thought out. You'll see there's also MIDI, audio in and out. It doesn't supply phantom power in the box, and when I'm using a microphone with it, I've used a dynamic microphone with an XLR at 1/4 inch into here, and you have to apply a lot of compression and boosting to be able to hear it. But thanks to software updates, you can also use external audio interfaces, and those external audio interfaces will allow you to use things like phantom power, condenser mics, things like that. Now, I personally have not done a lot of that with this yet, because I tend to produce my instrumentals and my general concepts just using this device with a dynamic mic, like I was saying earlier. And then if I want to finish things up, I'll export the stems and then record with a condenser mic in my DAW. But the fact that it is possible is, again, one of the big bonus points here. If you were starting out in music production, many people will probably tell you to get something simple and learn that. And I think there's a huge benefit and logic to learning something simple and then scaling up. I started with Sony Acid and then FL Studio until I got my way to Ableton, and then detoured through GarageBand and Logic, and then eventually also started using DAWless gear. There's no wrong way, in my opinion, to learn music production. Digital music production, physical, recorded music, it's all great, and you should follow your own path. But I can't imagine if you gave this to someone who is interested in music production and had them just inhale YouTube how-to videos and read guides and really understand it and then play with it. There's enough in here that you could go from absolute beginner to full large-scale music production savant, right? And there's almost nothing other than having to learn the specifics of the interface that would stop you from being able to do real full-scale music production, including vocal recording, including auto-tune, EQing, compressing, limiting, different factors of mixing. You have access to not just the individual tracks. If you're using drum programs, you have individual mixing for each pad. You can apply effects per pad or per group or per instrument or per entire track, I believe. And so with all of those options, obviously if you were to, layer effects and effects and effects on top of virtual instruments and render it in real time, you could eventually, hypothetically, hit some kind of computing limit, but that's hypothetical to me. I haven't seen it. I haven't pushed it quite that hard, and someone else maybe has. But I really could see this device being something that a person could pick up and have be the heart and the brain of everything they do. Now, one of the things that I think is a little weaker than the competitors is the sound quality of the internal synth engines. Specifically, I think the internal synths are great, and especially with the introduction of Hype and Odyssey, as well as Selena, and I know they added something else, but it's escaping me. But with those additional synths, you do have a ton of options for plugin programs and being able to utilize a lot of different virtual sounds. Along with that, you have what are called key groups, which let you use samples, either an individual sample spread over different keys or really complex multi-sampled per pad instruments. Because of key groups, you hypothetically can use any sound in this, right? And that's a really great way to augment some of the limitations of the onboard sounds. Now, this is a sampler, right? I mean, that's what MPCs traditionally have been. And so really, if you're comfortable recording and utilizing external sound sources, such as synthesizers, recorded instruments, other samples from other sources, anything is possible in this, right? So when I say the onboard sounds aren't quite as good as maybe the Machine Plus, I'm just saying what you can get out of the box, out of the gear, out of the OS without anything else. Because it can sample, because you can use key groups, those limitations can actually be almost eliminated. But I will say, if we're comparing something like the Machine Plus to the MPC Live II, one of the two areas I think the Machine Plus is better for me is just that the onboard synths are a little bit more robust. They sound better to my ears. They sound a little bit more modern and higher quality. It's hard to explain, and it's obviously subjective. But that being said, because the synths on here are designed for this, unlike the Machine Plus, you can do a lot of sound design in here. With basically any of the synths that are on here, you have a lot of control. You can create your own presets, you can save them, create your own drum programs, resample things, create key groups. So if you know what you're doing and you learn this thing, even if maybe the base level preset sounds are better on the Machine Plus than this, you probably can still close that gap, especially with the air effects and some of the other stuff that's on board here. I mentioned one other thing I think the Machine Plus does better, and that for me, and it's super subjective, is just the ease of the workflow and crafting a song. My brain understands the groups and the scenes setup of the Machine Plus a little bit more than it naturally understands the sequencing and the sequences and the tracks of the MPC Live. But at the end of the day, both of them, when you learn the workflows, can do really similar things. I'm pretty sure there's not a genuine arranger mode in the MPC Live II. Feel free to comment below if I'm wrong, and I'll eat my words. The Machine Plus has clips mode, which lets you record full-length arrangements. That can be pretty cool. However, the way I make music, I actually prefer working in clips and building things up until I build a sequence out. Then you can arrange different sequences in a song and export them with their stems. So for me, the way I actually produce music, this device and the Machine Plus are kind of tied for the actual functionality. It's more just the workflow. My brain more naturally understands the Machine Plus versus the MPC. But because I've spent a lot of time with the MPC Live I and the MPC Live II, I do understand it enough now to be able to build songs from scratch, as you've probably seen on my channel if you've been here before. If you haven't, there's plenty of videos with the MPC where you can kind of see me actually make stuff in real time, albeit usually with a little bit of sped up editing to cut out the boring parts, if you want a better idea of the workflow and how that actually looks from someone who's not necessarily an expert, but I do know my way around it. So, is it worth it? I think if you look at all possible music production scenarios, you can ask yourself a few questions. Do you want to use a computer? If you're comfortable with a computer, I think you're always going to get a little bit more power out of that. In my opinion, Ableton is basically the best perfect platonic ideal of how to make music for me. And if you augment it with appropriate MIDI controllers, it can become something very similar to a standalone Groovebox. However, I, like many of you and many other people in the world, work on a computer all day. And there's just such a good genuine argument to maybe not wanting to look at a computer interface after you spent all day looking at a computer. And there really is just something magical and tactile about the MPC Live II and the MPC Live I for that matter. It's just this whole unit designed to be contained, to be operated just here. Yes, there's a screen, so you're not escaping computers, right? But the way it's all designed, you're not just forced to look at a screen to do most things. When you start to learn the muscle memory of the controls, you really aren't just staring at a screen, you're composing and playing it like an instrument. And when you do need to use a screen, it has a touch screen, which lets you really quickly modify things in a way that feels different than most computers and different than the Machine Plus. Not that this is necessarily a one-to-one comparison video, but it's worth addressing that there are other options on the market. And although I've gone back and forth on whether I think the Machine Plus should have a touchscreen, the more I use this touchscreen, the more I see why it's a huge benefit. When I think about it, it's actually hard for me to imagine what Akai could even improve here. And that is just a huge testament to what they've done. It's a testament to taking the time to iterate and grow. It's a testament to supporting your hardware with free software updates. I mean, the state the original MPC Live was in when it launched versus what this thing is now and what the MPC Live original is now, thanks to updates that introduced way more software instruments, the vocal suite, and additional functionality. Akai, I think, has earned a reputation of being a great option for musicians, caring about musicians, and creating gear that really caters to the needs of musicians. I think it's awesome how well they're doing. I think the Machine Plus is very exciting because I like to see competition in the market. I think these two competitors existing will force each other to be better, which is fantastic. and I would love to see more companies enter the ring. You could very easily imagine Novation, for example, stepping up and making a Circuit Pro, or something that started to enter into the field of the Plus and the MPC Live II. There's been rumors for years of a standalone Ableton device. I would be very interested to see what a standalone Ableton Push would look like. But really, if we're looking at what's on the market now, to me, nothing beats the MPC Live II. There are specific areas where the competitors may be better, but the difference in quality is not enough to justify everything that this thing does right in 2022. When I think about, is it worth buying something after it's come out, right? Especially 2022. I believe the MPC Live II came out in 2020. We're 2 years out from when it was released, and I still just don't see anything I need that this doesn't do if I can learn how to do it, which again is my only real con, which is just, it is a different type of workflow, and much like any new workflow, it demands your time to understand it. And so I can't claim to be an expert. I can probably barely claim to be an intermediate. So take everything I'm saying with that knowledge in mind. But that being said, the fact there's so much to learn is such a pro. And the fact there's so much more I can do is really exciting to me. And so if you're thinking about picking one of these up, I basically wholeheartedly recommend it, just with the asterisk of, if you're coming from another platform, it's different, but I think it's worth it. If you're thinking about, should you get this versus other devices, I go back to, if you're comfortable with computers and screens, you can hypothetically get a similar, cheaper setup and use a lot of third-party plugins and things like that. I'm not someone who's ever going to not have a computer for music production. So when I say this is worth it, know that I also have a laptop that I do work with Ableton on. So I don't know if I can say this should be your only machine, but it absolutely could be. Just know that it's not mine. And I don't want to imply that this is the only thing I'm using, when I definitely have a wide variety of gear. Am I going to sell all of my other gear because I have this? No. But it is one of the coolest, most exciting pieces of gear I've ever used, and it's really hard to find a con with this. If you're thinking about getting the Live I versus the Live II, I really like this package. I like how it looks, I like the additional controls, I like the speaker. But they are not must-haves if the only thing stopping you from entering the ecosystem is the price tag. So if you want most of what this can do, but in a cheaper package, and you're willing to not have the speaker and not have some of the additional controls, the Live I is a fantastic option as well. As far as the MPC I, I've personally never had one. It seems extremely popular. People swear by it. For me, the MPC I has a bunch of the same issues that the Machine Plus does. It's obviously much cheaper compared to the Machine Plus, and the MPC workflow is really great. And so I could absolutely see an argument for the MPC I. If you were looking at the MPC I or an MPC Live, I would choose the MPC Live every time. If you can't afford to step up to the 2, I would choose an MPC Live 1 versus an MPC 1. But you should try to get your hands on both of them if you can, and see if one speaks to you more than the other. If you don't need battery power, or if you're comfortable using external batteries and something like a ripcord, then maybe the MPC 1 makes more sense for you. Because they all run the same OS and have the same onboard processors, to my knowledge, you're basically just saying, like, what form factor do you want, and do you need a battery? So yeah, to answer the question at the title of this video, yes, the MPC Live II is absolutely worth it in 2022. I'm gonna guess it's gonna be worth it for years to come. They knocked it out of the park. This is gonna be an all-time classic. This is like an OP1. This is, a Yamaha DX7. This is a standout piece of gear, and it's essentially the flagship of its category. So congratulations to Akai. They didn't sponsor this. I bought this with my own money, like I said, but they knocked it out of the park, and I can absolutely endorse it as one of the best pieces of gear I've ever used. So I'll catch you soon. Thanks for watching. Consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed the video. Appreciate your time. All right. Bye.